Today I'm going to show you how to mix metal, djent, and thall music, and I'm going to use a song that I put out about 2 months ago. Forgot to do this little walkthrough, so let's just jump right in. If you want a real-time mix tutorial, check out this video right here. Today I'm just going to go through the actual mix and show you which techniques I'm using for the drums, bass, guitars, and then I'm going to show you some really quick production tips that will take your mix from, let's say, an 8 to a 10. Let's go through each individual instrument, starting with the drums. What I always use on my kick and my snare drum is a plugin called Basement, and it's by Plugin Alliance by Unfiltered Audio. And what it does is it allows you to control your low end however you want. So let me just solo the kick drum for a second. Notice how much low end I'm adding of the sub frequencies. So I use that to get a little bit of my subs. I like overfold for that. And then when it comes to snares, I like to use resonate. And what that does is it cuts all the frequencies below your set frequency here, but boosts everything else. It's insane what this plugin adds. I love it. It's like the snare is a completely different sounding snare without it. And then with the EQ for the kick drum, I am adding quite a bit more low end, which obviously you'll need some speakers or some headphones to hear. And then I'm really just like, this song catered for a little bit more clickiness, and I found that these frequencies worked really well. Found it added a nice amount of click to it. I like, there's two options in this kick drum that I like. I really liked 4.5 and then around like 2K. This one sounds like it's more grounded in reality of what a kick drum would sound like, whereas this one just sounds like a metal kick drum. And then I found that there was a frequency that was just poking out that I didn't really like. So I cut it a bit, and then I added quite a bit more sub as well. And what I like to do with this frequency, let me solo it. I like to use the bell, and I like to use channel strips because when I'm doing surgical EQing, I like things like the FabFilter Pro Q3. But when I'm doing something that's creative and I'm getting a sound, I don't want to look at what I'm doing. I want to kind of just listen to what I'm doing. And this is really nice because it gives you like some areas that you are in, but you don't know exactly where you're in. You're not seeing on a graphical EQ what areas seem to be heavy. It's just you're using your ears because people are going to hear the song and they're not going to look at the song. And then I find that when I'm using the Basement first, I like to get something around 100 Hertz or a little bit higher than 100 Hertz and boost that, because it's like a lot of the strength from the kick, as we already have the sub frequencies in the Basement. What I've noticed for kick drums, I like to go basically as fast as it goes with the attack, and then the release, just go a little bit slower than the fastest, and that grabs it quite a bit. You'll notice that if you go a little bit too slow with the release, then when you're doing double kicks and stuff like that, the kicks really drop in volume. You just want to get a little bit of a grab without not much else. And then that's kind of it. I'm just making sure it doesn't clip. But not only that, we also do an auxiliary track, and with that auxiliary track is a distortion plugin on the kick drum. I always find that E on Decapitator seems to sound really good for the kick drum. It adds like a really nice clickiness. I often find when I'm trying to find like drum distortion plugins that I really like the sound of E from Decapitator on all of them, but then they all start to sound the same. So I've decided overall that I really like E for kick drum. When it comes to snare, I really like P for the most part. And then for toms, I always experiment, try to see which one sounds best. I usually find N or T on decapitator sound best for me. But anyways, sounds like that. And then let me take it out for a second. Just adds that extra bit of clickiness and just more punch. So that gives us our volume of our kick drum. What I find in general with drums is that it's really important to get your kick drum to be loud enough, because it'll pump the master bus and the mix bus, and that will really just make the whole song sound full. So next onto the snare, like as I've showed you, we got the basement. Adding a bunch of thickness to the low end. And then I have a Pro Q3 only for this specific snare. There's like a frequency that's ringing out. And I didn't really like the way it sounds in later parts of the song where there's a lot of snares happening. And especially since I'm using Devil Lock on the actual track itself, just to get a little bit extra sauce from the snare and a little bit more of the wires and the ring. That's it before. Just adding that extra bit of smack, and again, like the mix is at 2. And we're not doing a crazy amount of stuff, just Devil Lock on its own does its own wonders. And then with the EQ, we're doing some gnarly moves. So I'm pushing a lot of high end, it needed it. Honestly, there's a lot of times in my past where I've been like, that's too much high end. It looks like it's too much high end, but again, no one's ever gonna see your mix, people are gonna hear it. So just do whatever you need to push the frequencies you need. So much better. So basically, let me solo it and we can take a look at it. Adding all that high end adds the snap and the crackle and the pop. Not the pop. And then we're pushing similar frequencies as the kick. Getting those wire sounds a bit more. Sometimes I'll push some of the high mids as well instead of going like 4.5K. I just found that the snare didn't need it. Just sounded better to get a little bit more sizzle. We'll get back to the low mids in a second, but let me just show you what I'm doing with the low end. And then again on bell, and I'm kind of just finding the frequencies. It's usually around 200 or under. That works for me. So if you want to get 2 different sounds from your snare drum, it's actually really easy, and it's only one frequency band that's really making the difference. So check this out. I'm cutting quite a bit of around 800 hertz. Let's say you wanted a snare that was thicker as opposed to more snappy. Usually around 1K, if you cut quite a bit of it out, you get a lot more of like a fat sounding snare. Whereas if you go lower, around like 300 to 600 hertz, you get more of that snappy, crackly kind of snare. So just something to keep in mind, depending on what you're looking for. It's usually, you know, cut 1K to get that fat kind of snare, and then cut around like 400 hertz to get the thin kind of sounding crackly snare. I ended up liking somewhere in between. Oh, after that EQ, I actually had another EQ, the Psy EQ from Sound Toys. I really like this one. You can add some brightness without it getting like shrill. I like that a lot. As you can see, I added a lot of high end over here and high mids, and then I ended up adding more because getting 2 different kind of sonic characteristics from 2 different plugins will make a huge difference. And then when it comes to the compression for the snare, what I normally do is I go somewhere around here for the release, and then I go attack all the way, and I kind of just keep bringing it to be slower and slower of an attack until the snare pops out at a right amount. You'll notice at about 4, we're already getting the snare attack. So we don't have to go much quicker than that. I like around here just letting that a little bit more amount of snare come out before we start compressing. What I'm listening to with the release is seeing how long the sustain of like the wires lasts. So you can see that you can actually get rid of like the sound of the high end wires if you go all the way with the release. I'm finding somewhere around there lets me have the right amount of wire sound that I want. So it's all to taste for you. You do your thing. You might be in a situation where your snare drum, it's sounding pretty good, but you're always like, I wish it was just like a little bit stronger, a little bit more impactful. What you can do is limit your snare at the end of it. So what I like to use is this Universal Audio. It's like an 1176, but what I do is I take the ratio completely off. So instead of using it as a compressor, we're using it as a limiting amp. And it really just brings everything forward. I really like this approach. I used to go like ham with compressing the snare before, but I've recently, over the past couple of years, learned that like doing less with the compressor and just making it a little bit more even will allow you to put a limiter at the end and just like squash it in a really nice way. So what I normally do with this compressor and this effect is I kind of just like boost the input until it starts getting like a little bit too spongy. You'll see what I mean. So at a point we start actually distorting the snare because we're pushing the input so much that we're getting like this kind of preamp kind of distortion. That's what I really like about these plugins, since I at least mix in the box. Getting some sort of preamp distortion or the sound of preamp distortion is really important for me in my style of mixing. And then I often actually do that with a kick drum as well. The kick drum is just a lot more sensitive because of the amount of low end information that we have in it. As you can see, it just like distorts pretty quickly. So what I normally do when I'm using this technique for kick drum is basically just get it to the point where it's not distorting, but it's adding something. So this is what my snare distortion auxiliary is doing. Pretty cool. Now on to toms. Those are kind of like, honestly, if you have kick and snare right, the rest is good. This is my opinion. I feel like toms should be the loudest instrument in the entire mix because they don't happen often, and usually when they happen at like a time where there's so much going on that they kind of can get buried really quickly. I used to find that I would push a lot of low end into my toms to try to get them to sound like real life. And what I've noticed is that by just boosting like some of the fundamental frequency, like the low note of the toms, that seems to work better. And then also mostly like boosting high end and the high mids. What I like to do with toms is find the point where it sounds like the stick is hitting the skin. It's usually around 1.5 to 2K. And that's basically where my toms live. These, I'm using the Buster Oldhome drums. And if you've used them, you'll probably notice that the toms are already like super clicky. So a lot of times I actually have to cut out some of that clickiness. So obviously, especially with toms, make sure that you're hearing it in the mix because that will drastically change it. And then with the floor tom, kind of same thing. And then kind of same kind of technique with the toms. I either will do the same thing I do with the snare, where I add a limiter to the tom, or I'll add some sort of I do the same thing with the floor tom. I basically just find the frequency that sounds like the stick is hitting the drum skin. I boost that a little bit, and then I add the limiter. Hi-hats and ride, I usually kind of just leave as is, and then just use them for like reinforcement tracks. For the ride, I found for this specific song, I needed to go a little bit more. I usually don't add anything, but I just found that I needed the ride to be a little bit more like squashed, I guess, because it wasn't coming through enough. And then with the overheads, what I normally like to do, I'm a little bit late on this, but I usually will start the mix, at least mixing the drums with the overheads, because I want to make sure that everything's in phase with the overheads. What I normally do is cut a bit of like the harsh cymbal frequencies. I'll cut a bit of that and then just really keep them like super sizzly. Because for me, nothing's living in that high end except for the cymbals, whereas there's so much in metal music that's living in this like 2.5 to 3K area with guitars, vocals, drums, and bass. Like everything's living in there, that like I don't find that I often need that frequency with the cymbals, so I just cut a bit of it. And then I do the same. I use a plugin called Soothe just to clean out just to cut out some of those disgusting like pointy frequencies. And then I compress it a little bit with the close. This drum plugin has a close overhead and a far overhead. And with the close ones, I like to keep them not super compressed because I want like the initial attack of the cymbals. Whereas with the far ones, I squash them quite a bit because I really want the sustain of the cymbals. When it comes to cymbals and overheads, if you have your attack really fast, it'll actually make the snare quieter in those mics. So check this out. And that's because the snare is usually the loudest in the overheads. So if you took the attack all the way down, the snare is going to be the first thing that gets affected. So it's going to get quieter over time. And then when it comes to the room mic, what I normally like to do is make sure it's mostly snare in my room mic. If it's a live recorded kit, I can't really do anything. But when it comes to programmed drums, I basically just make sure that everything else is quite a bit quieter in the room mic. And then the snare is like the main thing. And then I add some distortion to it. In this case, a lot of distortion to it. Devil lock with compressing it as well as distorting it quite a bit. Adding a little bit of darkness. And then with this, I'm using another channel strip, basically just cutting out some of the nasty frequency here. But I do this with the drums all playing at the same time. And basically I cut that frequency that I'm boosting in the snare, the close mic of the snare, because I don't want too much living in that same area. If I have too much low end, it just like sounds a little bit strange. So I just cut that out. that works for me. And then I have all of my drums set to a parallel compressor. For this, I'm just using the FabFilter one, and yeah. What I'm doing is I'm having the attack pretty quick because I want to grab those snares again, and I want, basically this parallel is just to like thicken out the sustain of the cymbals as well as the rest of the kit. It's not really for the transients and for the attack, it's actually for the opposite. It's for all the tones to kind of live a bit more. So by having the release a lot slower, it's just allowing the tone to kind of sustain longer. And then last but certainly not least is my drum compressor. This is my go-to drum compressor. I use this on every single mix that I do. It's the Neve 33609. This one is by Universal Audio. I use a lot of Universal Audio plugins because my interface is Universal Audio and I want to cut down on my CPU usage. So using their DSP system is just like, it's kind of unmatched for saving computer space and latency. What I love about this plugin specifically is that we have a limiter right here and then we have a compressor right here. So what I normally do is kind of set my compression a little bit, not doing too much. And then I put my limiter on to make sure that I'm not going too far. But what's really cool about this plugin is that by having the limiter on, you can really push your like post gain from the compressor and get some gnarly sounds. So obviously that's a little bit too far, but I'm noticing more and more that the more I push my drum compressor, the more it just sounds like a sack of meat in the best way possible. So I think before I used to be like there. I mean, going a little bit further right now, I probably should have done this in the actual mix. I really like this. So that just adds a lot of strength to your cymbals as well as the drum tones and the room mics and everything. It's just like, as you can hear, the transients are still there, but we're just getting like what people call the glue. That's cool to me. Drums are a little loud overall now because I went that extra dB or two. I'm not gonna do bass next. We'll go to the guitars first and then we'll deal with everything else. So basically, I'm not gonna go over how I get my guitar tones because I've done a few videos on that. If you wanna check them out, you can check them out right here. But here's what my guitar sounds like. Basically, I go between having 3 layers of the exact same guitar. Usually one is like my normal guitar. One is like either a version with no cab or a version with like a really blown out sound, like fuzz. And then sometimes I'll do like a clean guitar that's just like rattle and mid. I didn't have enough either computer space, but also I just found that it didn't need it running the song. So the other option would be turning off the Ignite, which is kind of cool on its own. Kind of cool on its own too. So the guitars with that. So cool, say we have our set tone that we like here. I think this is pretty good as a starting point. What I do is I kind of group them. Ableton's really cool because you can do groups of groups instead of having to do like auxiliary tracks, which is what I normally do when I mix in Pro Tools. I still mix in Pro Tools, but for writing Ableton's the way to go. So let's say we have our sound here. What I've noticed, at least with my specific frequency setup, what I've noticed at least with my amp setup is that I do usually have to cut out around 2.7K. And the way I find this out, let's mute this right now. We'll play the guitars. And then I'm gonna make a little adjustment here. And I'm basically gonna sweep, instead of going high and sweeping and going lower, it's just like when I do that, when you do that, you kind of notice that like everything sounds bad, like when you're really pushing frequencies. I like to instead cut the frequency and see what it's doing. And to me, getting rid of some of that annoying fizz really helps with the clarity of the note. And then I found out there was an extra bit of fizz over here in 6K. Cut that a little bit. And then I noticed that specifically for these guitars in the mix, I noticed that there was like a little bit of mid that I didn't quite like, and sometimes I don't know exactly where it is. So what the classic way to do it, same way I did these, I just lower it. So you'll notice that when you go too far on either end, it either sounds like really hollow or it sounds really like low mid heavy. So it's basically just a matter of finding that pocket where you're adding a little bit of clarity to the guitars. And if it's not necessarily like you needing to clean up the guitars, it's more making room for the bass guitar. And then I do a little multi-band compressor, just like the classic when there's chugs, like later on in the song. Just making sure that those low mids get cut a little bit when there's like those heavy sustained chugs. Not really doing too much. And then I have a little bit of a compressor going on. This is this is Auto Audio, their heavy compressor. You can do it with like just about whatever compressor you have. It's just like I specifically am using this one for like more so the tone than the actual compression. As you can see, I'm not doing very much. It's just like kind of gluing it a little bit more. And just like with the drum bus, I also have a guitar crush bus, and that's a heavy compressor. And what I like to do with this one, same thing. I've noticed over time that I like my like close mics or my actual tracks to be more like with drums transients and with guitars kind of like also transients and attack and stuff like that. And what I like to use my bus compressors for is just cleaning everything up. So I noticed that like guitars like chugs pop out a lot, and when you sustain a chug it like gets really loud over time. So what I've noticed is that same thing, kind of having the attack pretty quick. And for this case, it's like not doing a lot, as you can hear and see. Let's go a little bit more. if I wanted to keep it normal sounding, I would have the attack as slow as possible and the release as quick as possible. And I've seen people use that technique to make chugs like pop out more, but like chugs already pop out more than anything else. So this is really just to like glue it in. And on its own, it doesn't sound good, but it's not supposed to be listened to on its own. It's really just adding like reinforcement for the guitar. And I find that 4 isn't like as strong of enough of a ratio. So with this technique, I usually go 20 for the ratio just to make sure I'm grabbing even more. And then dial it into taste. This isn't in the song, but just for example, when it comes to leads, I usually cut a lot of like high and low end. That's kind of the only special thing that I do with lead guitars, and it's not even special at all. Cool, so that's that. When it comes to bass, you know, this song is in drop, I think it's in drop C1, so it's already like in bass frequency. So with the bass, I recorded it with the same guitar, so they're both in the same frequency. They're both drop C1. So for the bass, I'm really just using it for the sub. And I'm noticing more and more over time that like distorted bass doesn't usually work very well for the style of music that I'm mixing. I've noticed that just like having a cleaner bass allows like the note to come through more, whereas having a distorted bass, it kind of just like blends into the guitar, and then it's harder, it's not impossible, but it's harder to get more separation between bass and guitar. So this is like what my bass ends up sounding like. And then what I basically do is just make sure it's adding the right amount of sub to my mix. For me, that's the right amount of sub. So another little special thing that I'm doing, it's not really special, but and then for the bass, this is what it sounds like without my pull tech. Basically just adding more of the sub frequencies, a little bit more of the 200 hertz, because I noticed it usually helps with like the actual note definition of the bass as opposed to just sub. And then cutting a bit of 500. I like that. And then yeah, kind of just this frequency, this bass specifically, since I'm using it for sub mostly. I just pushed the sub frequencies a bit, and then there was a little bit too much clang. It's actually here. And then just compressing it, because I want it to be like super, and then I'm just compressing it so that it's just like a wall of low end basically. Opto is a classic style compressor for bass. Really quick attack, and then same thing, having the release pretty long, that way it doesn't distort the bass when you're compressing it a lot. And then I let a little bit of the sub frequencies go through just so that we're getting not a total like compression right off the bat, because low frequencies get compressed first. So I like to have a little bit of like a sub frequency removed from the compressor. It's still there, it's just like the compressor is like ignoring it for a second. And honestly, when it comes to bass for this kind of music where the guitars are so low tuned, I'm by the end of it just making sure that when I turn it on and off, it makes a difference and that I'm hearing more of the sub frequencies. So what's important with bass too, as you'd imagine when it comes to kick drum and bass, there's like a relationship that can get really easily messed up. So what I find really handy is to basically we're multi-band compressing so that every time the kick drum goes off, the bass is getting ducked down quite a bit. And I'm cutting basically from 70 hertz down and making it so that the kick drum just like really feeds the low end, and then the bass is there still like 70 hertz and beyond, but then just like it's still there, it's just like we're cutting 20% of the volume at that point. I don't like to cut that much bass, just like a little bit so that we're getting the sub frequencies but getting a little bit of room for the kick drum. It's up to you. And I actually do that with the snare as well. And I just adjusted it a little bit better. So basically what I'm doing is cutting that same low fundamental of the snare drum that I added. And it's just like boosted. This one's cutting like 20% of the volume every time the snare goes off to give it that extra like low end push without it getting too much like low end build up, because low end builds up really quick. And then I actually do cut some of the low sub frequencies from the bass because they're just quite frankly not really needed. And then I actually do that same technique with the guitars. So the guitars, I'm cutting some sub frequencies on the kick drum every time it happens. Otherwise, there's quite a bit of low end in there, and I don't need that much low end. And then I'm doing the same thing, but with the snare. And since our snare was really a high frequency on this song, I probably could have got away with doing something more like this. That basically wraps up the mixing side of things. Now let's go to the mix bus, and this is where things get pretty fun. So I like to start off with a multi-band. You probably know it's just like every time there's like a heavy amount of a certain frequency, it's just cutting it a really small amount. So I'm on minus 60. It's really subtle and it's not doing like a crazy amount because I try to do all those things before we hit the mix bus. But these next ones actually shape the sound a crazy amount. So my mix bus compressor that I always choose is the SPL iron. Mostly like honestly because of the air bass section here. I just like the amount of low end and the amount of high end that it brings. So I actually start every mix by having this on, and it kind of just like caters my low end and my sizzle basically. And I just keep that in mind so that I'm not just like turning that on at the end of my mix. I'm the kind of person where I like to mix into my mix bus. Another thing that I started doing recently that really pushed my mix, I find, a little bit more and gave it a little bit more width. I don't use widening plugins, but what I really like to do is turn this into mid-side, and then I leave my mid at 0 dB, like not adding anything, and then I actually add 2 dB to my sides. And I find that it just gives my guitars like their own space, and it kind of works better than like boosting the volume without like, if I could technically mix this and keep them both at 0, but I found over time that like it kind of just like puts it in its own realm as opposed to just being louder on the sides. It kind of is just like, here's the sides for the guitars, you know, or whatever's on the side. So I always do that now. And then I always like this one because there's like a mono maker, so I'm basically making sure that 64 hertz are in the center and there's no 64 hertz on the side. And then my high filter, I kind of just like, same thing. I let a little bit of the low end pass before the compression starts. I'm trying not to affect the actual like transients of the mix, so I leave the attack slow as possible, as fast as possible for the release. And then for the sides, I actually just go like a little bit quicker on the sides, just to get a little bit of a different kind of compression on the sides as opposed to the middle. And then next, this plugin makes a huge difference on my mix. It's More is More by Auto Audio. So here's with it. So I'm using it as a clipper, as you can see here. It's crazy how far you can actually push it. I find that around 3 is usually where I sit. I don't really add extra volume because I usually mix pretty hot. I make sure it's not clipping on the way in, but I like to mix pretty hot. And then I like to add a little bit of this saturation here. Just a little bit. And at this section here, if you click on this button here, we get the transient section, and basically just like adding a little bit more of those transients back into the mix. I don't go all the way with the mix because it adds a little bit too much high end, and usually I just want like the snappiness from the transients. So I find around like between 25 and 50% is usually where I sit with this one, and I kind of just dial it in pretty early in the mix, and then I'm mixing into it so that all of my choices are living in there. And then what I've recently started using is a Shadow Hills mastering compressor. And this is really just like for me to hear what my mix sounds like before mastering. So these next two plugins, when I'm sending it to my mastering engineer, Federico, I just turn them off. So this is what my mix sounds like. And then these next two are basically just like what my master would sound like. And usually when I'm mixing, I like to sit at like -7 or -6 Lufus, which I know is absolutely insane and super loud. But for metal, I just find it sounds best when it's pushed like that. And I like to push my master pretty hard just to make sure that it's going to sit right. I'm not a professional mastering engineer, so I just do like a really basic like compressor and then the limiter. And then, yeah, that's my entire mix. And then actually before we leave, totally forgot about this, but let me show you some of the extra production that I'm adding. I'm personally using my own sample pack, Tape Toys. I will leave a link down below, but just keep in mind, like, you don't have to use my pack. This is what I used. And basically I'm just like adding a bunch of, this is where like it draws the line between like mixing and production. And whenever I'm mixing for a band, I always do this stuff because realistically this makes the mix sound better. So even though it's technically kind of like a production thing, it makes the mix sound better, so it's a mixing thing to me. I think as mixers, it's like it's okay to add things like 808s and to add things like claps on snares when you need to, just to get that extra sauce and reverbs. So over this breakdown specifically, I'm adding an 808 right off the bat. And that kind of synthetic alien sound. As well as an 808. As well as like a big stomp with reverb on it. And then for the snares, I have a clap. As well as like a shutter from a camera sound. And without it, I think they could be a little bit louder. So just like little extra things like that, and then I'm adding like throughout the song there's like impacts, so 808s or like those explosion sounds right at the beginning of the song. There's also like a bit of a like reverse cymbal. It's a reverse crash. And then same thing, adding that one. Just adding those little like extra like saucy moments just kind of bring the mix from, in my opinion, like even if it's at an 8, it just brings it at least to a 9 just by adding like the impact when it needs to have impact. Sometimes you'll be like, oh, like the chorus doesn't feel chorusy enough, and it's because there's like not an initial like 808 or like impact kind of hit, and it's also sometimes because there's not like some sort of reverb on the snare or like crack or claps going on the snare. That kind of stuff can add a lot to your mix. Hope you enjoyed it, and I just want to like remind you that you don't want to sound like other people as a mixing engineer. Like the coolest thing to me, and I think to a lot of people, was like back in the day when like you'd hear a Will Putney mix or you'd hear like a Kurt Ballou mix, and you'd be like, that's them, you know, like that's Will or that's Kurt or whatever. Nowadays, it's like so hard to tell who's mixed what because it's just like it's clean and polished, and that's kind of like the sound. There's nothing cooler than having like your own sound as a mixer. I haven't found mine yet. I still find like it lives, like somebody could hear a mix and be like, I don't know who the hell did that, you know? I haven't got to that point yet, but I just want to remind you, like, these are just guidelines, and really what matters is that you're making the music sound how it should, you know? If it's metalcore and it's like supposed to be polished, then make sure it's polished. If it's metalcore and it's supposed to be like grungy and distorted, then push it over the top. And if it sounds like destroyed, like if it sounds like what the music is meant to sound like, that's a good mix. So just keep that in mind. Don't let other people tell you too much what to do. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you in the next one.